And I left, and I was halfway home when my phone rang, and it was the girl I had just left at the hotel. I think she's the girl that's listed as missing on the police department's Facebook page. And I said, well, how sure are you? And she said, I'm not sure, but she looks young and she looks a lot like this girl in the picture, but I can't get that close to her because he's still there.
Welcome to Critical Incidents Podcast, where we explore life-defining moments. I'm your host, Kyle Ashley, a law enforcement veteran with over a decade of experience. Each episode, I'll be interviewing people about their own critical incident, a moment in their lives that shaped who they are today. From life-threatening emergencies to personal struggles, we'll hear firsthand accounts of resilience, determination, and the power of the human spirit. So sit back and let's dive into the critical incidents that shaped their lives and made them who they are.
My name is Leah Dee. I'm host of Leah Dee's podcast, and for the past several years, I've been working as a victim advocate with those who are victims of human trafficking. My critical incident was when I responded to the trafficking of a minor. My first experience was when I had a very close friend who went missing, and his family was looking for him, and he was actually reported missing. He had left a hospital against medical advice, and at the time he was suffering from a mental health crisis and didn't know his own name. The family was getting very limited cooperation from law enforcement. They kind of took the attitude that he was someone who suffered from substance abuse. And I believe the detective on the phone at one point, her exact words were, "You'll find your friend. He'll be overdosed in a ditch somewhere." At that point, this was someone that I knew prior to his substance abuse issues, and he had served this country. And it really got to me, as I have members of my own family who suffer from substance abuse issues. So it got to me, the attitude that the police took. And this was the actual detective that was assigned to his case. So I decided to do what I could to help his family find him. So I reached out to local fire stations in the area where he had gone missing from. Since we weren't getting cooperation from the police, I thought that there was a possibility that he had made contact with, paramedics or something of that nature, since he was in a crisis state. And that did turn out to be what had happened. So when he had left the first hospital, he had gone back into the street and something had happened. I'm not sure any of us really know what had happened, but he was found on a park bench and transported to the hospital. But like I said, at the time, he didn't even know his own name. So once I started reaching out, I actually contacted, I want to say it was a captain at the time. She was in charge of the fire department for that jurisdiction. I think she was a captain. She was prior Air Force, and her dad was Air Force. And so the military veteran thing really stuck out to her, and she took his missing flyer and distributed it to all of her paramedics. And that's how he was recognized. It was at that point that I realized that sometimes when it comes to locating someone who's missing, you have to think outside the box. And we weren't getting anywhere with law enforcement. So that's what we did. And it wound up being a really good thing for him. He got treatment, got help, and he is doing great today. So that's how I got into all of this, working with people who had substance abuse issues. Substance abuse and human trafficking kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways. And so once I started working with different families, because after I helped him, I saw that there was a need. And I did end up working with different law enforcement agencies on missing persons cases, especially when substance abuse played a factor. And it was through that I learned that substance abuse and human trafficking often go hand in hand. And so when I moved to my current location in Southern Georgia, I found out that it's actually a hub for human trafficking. So I became more involved in that, at first on my own, and then with an organization for almost a year. And we are back on our own now. I think a lot of people do get confused with what the actual definition of human trafficking is and their idea of what that looks like. Human trafficking occurs when a trafficker uses force, fraud, or coercion to control another person for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex acts or soliciting labor or services against his or her will. Force, fraud, or coercion always need to be present unless the individual engaging in commercial sex is under the age of 18. If that's the case, then it is always considered human trafficking. And in my story, that was the case. So a lot of the hotels in our area are run down, and there are people who live there who have just fallen on hard times, or a lot of the girls that live in those hotels do work in the sex trade. And so I had been there that day checking in because I do have a relationship with several of the girls that live in those hotels. And so I was there that day just checking in with them and seeing how they were and bringing some snack bags. It was actually just like any other day. And at first, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I went and seen one of them and we talked and we chatted and I gave her snacks, and there were about 3 or 4 more girls. I did happen to notice a guy that I had never seen before. And this particular hotel was one that I'm very familiar with. And I did notice a guy kind of hanging on the corner, and he was someone I didn't recognize, and he did not want to engage with me, which is odd because people do know why I'm there, and everybody likes snacks. So even though I'm there for the girls, a lot of times there are males that'll come up and ask if they can get a snack bag or just come by to say hey. So when I'm going down to the hotel to visit, I think of it as kind of an outreach. I'm just there to let them know, especially the girls who I do know are engaged in commercial sex work. Some of them are there because they want to be, but there are several that are there because they have to be. I said before that substance abuse and human trafficking go hand in hand. A lot of the girls have substance abuse issues, and so the way that they fuel their addiction is through sex work. And when someone is in control of that, like for many of the girls, they do have what you would call a pimp who takes a cut of their money and provides them with shelter and usually drugs. In order for it to be considered human trafficking, you do have to have fraud, coercion, or force. But what you also have to have is an exchange of money. And it's not always money. It can be anything of value, which could be shelter, food. It could also be drugs if someone's addicted. So they have to engage in these acts to get the substance that their body needs at this point because it is an addiction. So when I go out, it's just simply to tell them that when they're ready, there's an option, and I do have resources available that can help get them off the street, help place them in treatment facilities if that's what they're looking for, or even in the event that something happens, something bad happens, because this is a high-risk lifestyle, and so they're frequently victims of violent crime. And if something did happen, to get them to the right police officer. Because if there's one thing that I've learned, is that the right officer can make or break them coming forward. So that's another part of the job, but it's just a conversation, and it's more than a conversation one time. It's a relationship that I've built with them. And so when I go out and just hand out snacks or whatever, I'm just checking in to see how everybody's doing, and they know that at any point in time when they're ready, they can tell me that they're ready to get out, and we will make that happen. So that day I was just there checking in on everybody, and everything was normal.
And how important is it when you're talking with these girls that you're not trying to like pressure them into, hey, if you come with me now, I can help you get into rehab. I can get you out of this lifestyle. I know that's a part of the conversation, but is it something that you bring up often, or is this like a decision that they have to make like because you're there regularly, they know that that is always an option. And sometimes they're going to run into a situation where they're just done with the lifestyle that they're living and they're ready to get out of it.
So that's the most important part. It's not a conversation that you have every day. I'm not there to pressure them out of the lifestyle. I'm not there to judge them for their lifestyle. I'm simply there to let them know that when that day comes that they're ready, or if they're not ready to even leave the lifestyle, but they're ready to come off of drugs, or they need something to eat. That's what I'm there for. I want them to know that there's an option and there's a way out. And so most of our conversations are pretty basic and pretty normal. It's kind of like, hey, how are you? How are the kids? A lot of these girls are mothers, and some of them do have visitation, obviously, with their children. And so they ask about mine and I ask about theirs, or how their day was. So a lot of the times the conversation is just as normal as if you were talking to a friend, because ultimately I feel like that's what we end up becoming is it's just friends. I'm just there to let them know that when they're ready, they can get out. And I'm also there to make sure that while they're living that lifestyle, they have the basic things that every human deserves.
So when they do make this decision, for example, and it's 3 a.m. in the morning and they call you and they're like, hey, Leah, I'm done. I need out. Can you walk us through like the process and what do you do in that situation?
So the process for someone coming out would be first for them to, for me to assess their individual needs, because like I said, it could be a different situation with any of them. So some of them would just need drug treatment. Other ones would need a safe house because they're escaping actual human trafficking. So I would evaluate the situation and see what resources were needed. And then from that point, there are different organizations that actually provide the treatment. There are resources out there and places for these girls to go because sometimes they need a safe house. Sometimes they need drug treatment. So it would just be matching them with their need. And then it's on them. I'll provide the transportation. I will come and get you there safely. But then it's on them. There are applications that have to be filled out for each place in an interview process. And we would work on that quietly until the day it is the day to leave. And understand that sometimes when they say they're ready, you have to be ready to leave. You have to be ready to leave at that very moment and get them somewhere safe. So there are places where they can be taken, and then we can work on their application process at that point when they are safe. But it's that simple. It's that simple. It's like, I'm ready to go. And if we just go, and sometimes it means just figuring it out on the fly. Like, we got to get you somewhere, and then we've got to figure out detox, and then where to go after that. Because someone who's been the victim of human trafficking is going to need more than drug treatment, and they're going to need specialized counseling. I feel like a lot of times they need someone who knows what they've been through. And these places that specialize in that, they have people there that are also victims. And, it makes the girls feel a lot less alone.
So you're down at these hotels this particular day, and you come across a guy standing on the corner that you don't recognize. And so what happens then? So
I didn't recognize him. And it was odd because, it's a small hotel. It's like very small. And so if you're standing on one end, you can yell to the other. It's not multi-layer. It's just a one-level hotel. And he was on one end and I was kind of in the middle. And I was handing out snacks and talking, and some of the girls needed feminine hygiene products. So I remember going back to the trunk and watching him to get some out of the back of my trunk for them. So I remember watching him, and he was watching me pretty intently, but he definitely didn't want to make any kind of contact. He didn't want to talk to me, and he didn't really, I could tell that he was, how you can tell someone's doesn't want you to talk to them. Like, his body language said it all. Like, he just wanted to stand on that corner and watch what he was watching or whatever he was doing. But he wanted nothing to do with me, which was odd because a lot of people know that I got snacks. So I finished up the day, and I, talked to my girl, and everything was fine. We kind of chit chatted about how her week had been going, and she got some snacks. Another girl got some feminine hygiene products and soap, and we chit chatted, and I left. And I was halfway home when my phone rang, and it was the girl I had just left at the hotel. So she called and she said, I know that you just left, but remember that guy that was standing on the corner? And I'm like, well, yeah, he seemed kind of off. And in my mind, when I was standing there and he was acting the way that he was, I'm not going to lie, I was silently judging that maybe he knows what I'm there for, because there are some people who know that I'm there to help girls get out. So I was silently thinking in my head, like, well, maybe that's why he's so standoffish. And she said, so the girl called and she said, do you remember that guy? There's a young girl in his room. I think she's the girl that's listed as missing on the police department's Facebook page. And so we stayed on the phone and she sent me a picture, a screenshot of the missing person poster. And it said it was a runaway juvenile. She was 16. And I said, well, how sure are you? And she said, I'm not sure, but she looks young and she looks a lot like this girl in the picture, but I can't get that close to her because he's still there. So I just remember shaking, because this girl, I've known her for a long time. And when she tells you something, you need to listen. She has her ear to the street, and she has lived in that particular hotel for quite a while at that time. And she knew everybody that came in and out of there. And she said, I really feel like it's this girl, but I want you to come back and make sure that I'm not wrong. And so I remember just feeling, I don't get scared, and I was nervous because I don't particularly work with minors. Like I said, if a minor is engaged in any kind of commercial sex, that is human trafficking, and that is 100% do not pass go. Do not wait to get them out. You call the police. So it's not something that I typically deal with. It's something that I've dealt with. It just comes with the territory, but it's very nerve-wracking for me because I know what the stakes are. That's somebody's child. This girl was 16 years old. She had no business at that hotel in the first place, and she damn sure had no business with a grown-ass man, and that's what he was. So I sat there for a minute thinking, okay, what do I do? Do I tell her, yeah, call and report it? Because it's easy to report it. There's a 1-800 number, and that's what you do. But something told me that I needed to go back. So I did. But I didn't want to be obvious, because that's the other thing. If I show back up after I just left, I have a pretty set schedule at this point in time of when I'm there and when I'm not. They know what days I'm going to be there. It was 2 days a week. I would actually come by. I'm always available by phone for the most part. So if I come back, people are going to know something's up. And you don't want to alert the entire hotel, because this is a high crime area, and, bad things happen. And if they know I'm coming back, and that's the reason, because he obviously, if that's what's happening, this guy knows she's a minor. So if I go back, he knows I'm probably going to call the cops, and that's not going to be taken so well, especially a minor, because it sounds awful to say, but it's true. Their value on the street is higher than an adult. So he's not going to want to lose that. So I remember being nervous, and like I said, I go there twice a week. It's not something I'm nervous about, but I just didn't know what my explanation was going to be. So I was trying to cook one up on the way over there. So I end up calling her back, and I'm like, hey, I'm going to bring you food. You're hungry. So that was another thing that I would do periodically. Sometimes I would take the girls food that they requested. Like, they don't have vehicles, so they're stuck in this one area. So one of my girls in particular, she really loved Long John Silver's. So every now and then I'd pop in there and bring her something hot to eat. So that was the plan I came up with. I'm just going to act like I'm bringing her food, because I can't think of anything else I can do at this point. I mean, I was just there for an hour. It's going to be obvious. You can see the entire parking lot from any room in that hotel. So I popped by the local Burger King and I got her some food. And it was so funny because on the phone, she's going, don't waste your money. I'm not hungry. And I was like, listen, I need you to be hungry right now. Like, you're hungry and I'm going to bring you this food. And I don't care how not hungry you are. You're going to act like you're eating it. So it took her a second. She's like, oh, okay, I got you. So I go pop through the Burger King, get her food, get me food. So it looks like, we're just there eating together. So I pull back up, but she's not outside. My girl's outside, but I don't see the girl that she's describing and the girl from the flyer. So I'm like, great. Did she already leave? I also don't see the guy. So I pull into the parking lot. I go over to my girl's room and I knock on the door and she comes out and we sit on the back of my truck and we're eating together. And I said, where are they? And she said, they're in room number such and such. And so from where we're sitting, we have a pretty good view of their room. And it looked like at first maybe they had left and nobody was in there and she had missed it because the curtain was pulled. You couldn't see anything in there. So we're talking for a few minutes and she says, Leah, I'm sure it's her. She said, I'm sure it's her and I don't want to be too obvious because they're going to think that I snitched and, I live here. So we had that little bit of a moral debate, like, what do we do? Because now I've been here twice. We're sitting outside. The cops are going to come. They're going to know it was her. So then I'm thinking in the back of my head, like, how can we make this not so obvious? So we were sitting there eating. And finally, the guy comes out of the room and he goes back to the corner where he was standing before. And it looks like a little dope deal goes down with him and another guy. And while he's outside, while he's on the corner, he left the door open to their hotel room. And so I go walking down the sidewalk because at this point I'm like, I got to lay eyes on this girl and know she's here because I've got to do something. Every second I was getting more nervous. Like, if I don't do something now, there's no telling where she could be. We're not far from Atlanta. We're not far from Miami. And we know that girls pass through here all the time that are trafficked. And this is a child. So I am getting more panicked by the moment. Like, what if she's already gone? How can I make sure it's her? I don't want to cause this big ruckus and it not be her. But I knew I had to do something. So I walk by the room and I can see that there's someone inside the room and I can kind of see her, but it's not enough for me to be able to tell anything. So I just ended up walking by him because the other part of my job is that I do know who some of the traffickers are. I didn't really recognize him from a distance, but I thought, well, maybe he'll say something that'll give me some type of clue. So I walked by him and I actually spoke and asked him if he was hungry because I still had French fries and stuff left. Well, he wanted absolutely nothing to do with me once again. And he made sure I knew that in the way that he addressed me. So I walked back over to my truck and I waited and we drank our drinks real slow and we just kept talking. And finally the girl walked out of the room. And when she walked out of the room, she spoke to him on the corner and then she walked into another room, which was not the room that they had. It was a completely different room. And at that point, I knew that something was off because they already had a room that he was sharing with her. Why would she be in another? Why would they have two rooms? We're talking about the poorest section of town. We're talking about people who don't have much money. You don't stay at that hotel because, it's vacation. You stay at that hotel because times are desperate. A lot of the people that are in that hotel have lived in that hotel for years. So it was odd that they would have two rooms. And then I thought, well, maybe it's a friend's room, but she went in there with a purpose. And then a few seconds later, a car pulled up with a guy. And he went down and talked to the guy that was on the corner that she had been with. And then he looked around and got in his car and left. And I thought, I think it's my presence here, why that guy didn't end up in that room. Or maybe it was a negotiation over money. I have no idea, but I knew in my heart that that guy talking to the other guy in the corner had something to do with the girl in the room. So after the guy left, she come back out. And this time I made sure I was standing on that sidewalk where I could see her face. And as soon as I seen her face, I knew it was the girl from the Facebook post. I also want to note that when she walked by me, at first she avoided eye contact. She was looking dead at the ground. And then when she got close enough where I could see her, but there was a pillar blocking the view of the guy standing on the corner who was watching her. Like, let me just tell you, he followed her with his eyes from the moment she walked out of their room into the other room. He followed her on her way back. He didn't take his eyes off of her. And if she was in a room, then he was looking at that room. So at first, when she was walking by, she kept her face turned down. And then when she got close enough to me where there was a pillar between me and him, and so if he was looking, he wouldn't have been able to see, she did raise her face towards me, and she had a look in her eye like something was wrong. And then as soon as she stepped past me and back in his view, she looked back down at the ground. So I knew 100% this is what's happening. So I couldn't call 911 right there in front of God and everybody. So I wrapped up my conversation with my girl, and I told her I would take care of it because she was very concerned. At that point, she's like, look, we're both sure. And I said, don't worry, I'll handle it. You just go in your room and act like you don't know what's going on. And I'll wait a few minutes, but I'm not going to wait more than 5 because this has to be handled right now before, they're tipped off that I know something. And he takes her. So I drove to a location that I could still see the hotel from, but he couldn't see me from the angle of the hotel, and I was in a different parking lot. And I immediately called a detective that I had worked with in the past and had a great relationship with and knew that he frequently worked in that area. And so I told him what was going on, and I decided just to be sure I was going to hang around until officers arrived. And so I did. I hung out in the other parking lot and waited for officers to arrive. They showed up ever so quietly. It wasn't lights blazing or anything crazy like that. They were already, I had already told them the room number and they were in this room and his description and her full description, and told them that I was 99.9% sure that it was their runaway child. And so they came in, and at first it was just one cop. And that cop car pulled up, and he waited for a few minutes, and then the guy kind of went like he was going to leave, and he stopped him and talked to him. And while he had the guy, distracted and kind of not in his control, but right where he could take him if he needed to, several more cop cars rolled up, and they went into the room and they located the missing juvenile, and she was taken into custody for her safety, and the guy that was with her was arrested.
So ultimately, you were able to get this girl out of the arms of what we presume is a human trafficker.
He wasn't a trafficker that I was familiar with, but of course, law enforcement, they were familiar with him, and he had a record. So he was apprehended, and he was eventually charged with crimes relating to that situation. And she, of course, since she is a minor, I don't get much information, but I do know Child Protective Services was working with her to get her in a safe place because she did have some issues at home.
What did you learn from this incident, and how have you used that to help others?
I think there's 3 main things I learned. Number 1, not to discount someone because of their situation in life. So this is one incident where a girl who engages in commercial sex and has addiction problems was able to save the life of a child. This is not the only situation that I've even been involved in. And I think a lot of times people discount girls like her or women like her. She's not a girl. She's a full grown woman, but they discount them because of their situation in life. But just as much as I cared about that little girl who was 16 in the hands of a human trafficker, my girl is the one who initially made the call. She called me because she knew that I knew somebody who could handle it. And I think a lot of times people don't listen. And I know that there are some in law enforcement who at least in my area, who will discount the information because of the source. Those girls that have lived that life or are currently living that life know the risk and the danger involved with it and the heartache that can come with it. And they, more than anyone, are going to protect a 16-year-old child that's out there. She wasted no time calling me. As soon as she had the suspicion, it was done. And I questioned her safety, but she never questioned her safety. So I think for me, that was one of many lessons my girls taught me. And that was that they care. Number 2, I learned to kind of trust your gut. I mean, there were moments in time, because this didn't happen very fast. There were plenty of moments where I could have said, no, maybe she's wrong. I'm going to go home. I had things to do. But I stayed, and I stayed because I couldn't leave that place and know that there was a possibility that a child was there. And I think the other thing I learned is that was a bright, shining example of the fact that trafficking doesn't look like trafficking. I mean, we all expect and we hear horror stories, and yes, it does happen that way sometimes, and someone is snatched up off the street. This girl was lured out. This girl was having trouble in her home life. She was a teenager. She left willingly. She went with this guy, I'm sure willingly. I don't know all the details of the case because that wouldn't be something I'm privy to since she was a minor. But I do know that there was no forced kidnapping because that would have been in the wanted poster. She was a runaway. She left her house willingly, likely to meet up with this guy. And listen, I'm sure he promised this girl the world because they all do. I think a lot of people think that human trafficking has to be violent, but sometimes human trafficking isn't violent at all, at least not in the beginning. It's, I love you and I'll take care of you. And if you come with me, you can, I'll provide your food and your shelter and you can just depend on me. But, you just got to do this one thing for me. And sometimes, and most often, they're not told that from the beginning. It's a relationship. They think they're in love with these guys. And to me, that's what this looked like. I mean, I can't be for sure because I don't have all the details, but I know she went willingly. And she was not trying to run away from him. She was there with him in a situation that I don't think she knew how to safely get out of at that point, because then it's too late. Once you're with them and you're under their control, they need help out. So I think it was a small thing. It was small. The girl was young. The guy was watching her. I mean, basically, those were the two things that told me something was wrong. This girl is not where she belongs. She has no business at this hotel in this area. Absolutely none. She's too young. And why in the hell is this guy watching her like that? Sometimes it's very subtle. And I think we all need to be more aware of what it can look like, because you could have easily mistaken that for a kid skipping school, She's skipping school, hanging out with her friends. She's hanging out in a hotel, smoking pot or whatever. You could have easily walked right by that and not recognized what it was. The only reason that I did is because A, I had my girl calling me, and B, I'd seen it before. So I think the main lesson that comes from that is it's not always what you think it's going to look like. Sometimes it's so subtle that if you blink, you miss it.
What resources can everyone who's listening use? And what would be a good way to kind of go forward with if they think something isn't right, or if they think that there might be a situation where they see human trafficking or commercial sex work? What should they do?
So I would encourage everyone to visit polarisproject.gov. There is actually free training available on the site. You just have to fill out your name and your email. It's completely free. And at the end of the course, you are given a certificate stating that you completed Human Trafficking 101, but it will teach you how to recognize the signs. And there are some survivors' stories on there. And I always think that's the best way to learn, is to hear it from someone who lived it. Those stories are amazing. And it shows you just the different aspects of human trafficking. There's all kinds of resources on the website. And if you find yourself in a situation where you suspect human trafficking, the best thing you can do is call. So I think that depends on the situation. If you think someone is in immediate danger, even if you're not 1,000,000% sure, it would always be better to call and be wrong than to not call and be right. So if you see a situation such as that one with a minor, you should call 911 because that deserves an immediate response. If it's a situation where it's an adult and you don't think that person is in immediate danger, because if you believe an adult's in immediate danger, obviously call 911 and report it. But if you happen to see an adult and you have a suspicion that she's being trafficked, but you don't feel at that point in time she's in immediate danger, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Someone's available 24/7 and they can speak 200 languages. The number is 1-888-373-7888, or you can text the words "Be Free" to 233-733. That also goes for someone who is a victim of human trafficking and just so happens to be listening to this episode. There are resources available and there are people who are willing to come in there and get you out and get you to safety and get you the help that you need, whether it's housing, whether it's food, whether it's drug treatment. There's always a way out. And I would encourage anyone who maybe even has a family member, because that's another thing I don't think people realize is sometimes it's not a stranger down the street that's being trafficked. These people have families. And if you suspect your family member is being trafficked, you can call the hotline as well. They have resources for literally everyone, and it's completely free. So I think a lot of times there is this judgment immediately, especially someone who does commercial sex work. But not even just that. There's also this judgment of someone who's suffering from substance abuse issues. And people feel as if this is the life that they chose. This is what they want to do. They're the ones that have stuck the needle in their arm. They're the ones that, that are crushing the pills, whatever it is. And yes, at some point, for most, not all, because here's another thing that people don't understand about human trafficking is sometimes the cage is the drug. We think we have these horrific images of people locked in cages. And does that happen? Yes. More often in other countries. But does it happen in the United States? I'm sure that it does. But they don't even need that anymore. They have all these different substances at their disposal. So sometimes these girls never even made the choice that, hey, I want to shoot heroin. That choice was forced upon them by their trafficker. That choice was forced upon them when they were teenagers or children. I mean, there are some of these girls that have been out there that I personally know since the age of 12 and did drugs with their parents because that's what their parents did. And, they didn't get a choice. So they don't always have a choice. But for many, some willingly start off that way. Some willingly take the drug the first time, to escape something or maybe just to have fun. But at a certain time, their bodies and their brains are chemically dependent on this substance. So now they're taking that shot. They're taking that hit. They're snorting that line simply to function. It's not fun anymore. I don't think anyone could look at someone who truly suffers from an addiction problem and has made it to the point where they're living on the street and say, hey, that looks fun, because it's not. It's homelessness. It's hunger. It's needing that drug over everything else. And I think a lot of times we're real quick to judge the person in their current state. And we fail to see who they used to be or who they have the potential to become. Two of my very closest friends are in recovery. I knew them before, I knew them during, and I know them now in recovery. And there were points in time where I myself wanted to give up and say, you know what? We've done this before. You've been to rehab before. You've tried this. We tried this. It didn't work. This must just be what you want. I understand the frustration and I understand the judgment. Like from the outside looking in, you're like, why in the hell are you doing this? But I just don't think you ever give up on someone. And I think it does us a lot of good to understand, to try and understand, okay, this was a choice at some point, maybe, but it's not anymore. And how can I help them heal? Because that's what recovery is about. It's about healing. And I'll tell you that I have seen the most hopeless situation come out to be positive. And, a lot of my girls that I've worked with on the street do suffer from substance abuse, but I have seen some of them get clean. I have seen some of them get custody of their children back, get a house, get an apartment, get a job. Sometimes the easiest way for someone to get off the street is simply for them to get a job. I have seen that work where it was just, they just needed a job and a way to provide for themselves so they didn't have to rely on a human trafficker. It was that simple. So I think we really need to decide that someone's value is not equivalent to their current situation in life. And that even that person that you see on the street corner who's homeless and likely dirty and probably shot up 45 minutes ago, he's somebody's kid. Somebody out there loves him, and he has far greater potential than what you see in that moment. And I think we should be trying to help those people reach that potential. Instead of being judgmental or instead of saying why, we should ask how we can help. And just wait till they're ready, because sometimes they're not ready. Just like I said, I've had friends, it's taken 4 or 5 times. And hey, they got it on the 5th time. Is that frustrating for a family? Absolutely. But is it worth it in the end? Yeah, it is. So when we're talking about statistics, it's estimated that there are between 24.9 million victims worldwide at any given time. These victims are of all ages, all backgrounds, all nationalities. Some other nonprofits that work against human trafficking estimate that that number is even higher and somewhere around 40 million. And there are several warning signs that could tip you off that someone is being trafficked. So, for instance, if someone says that they want to stop participating in sex work, but they feel scared, trapped, or unable to leave. They disclose that they were reluctant to engage in sex work, but that someone actually pressured them into it. They live where they work or are transported by someone. So, for example, a lot of the girls live and work in the hotels, and if they go somewhere, there's someone there watching them, or someone has to give them a ride somewhere. In other words, they're just stuck. They have a pimp or a manager in the sex trade. That's actually not legal if we're talking about legal prostitution or brothels or anything like that. So if there's someone who's above them and is getting a cut of their money, that should be, that's a major red flag. So another warning sign can be that they work in an industry where it's common to be pressured into performing sex acts for money. So strip clubs or a go-go bar, maybe an illegal massage business. A lot of women are actually recruited through those. So, she starts out at the strip club and then it's, hey, you want to make a little bit of extra money. And then next thing you know, she is being trafficked. Someone who has an older or controlling parent, guardian, romantic partner, or just anyone in their life who seems to be controlling them. So, for instance, they won't allow them to meet with the person alone. They're always around, or they monitor their movements, what they spend their money on, and who they talk to. So a lot of recruiting happens in strip clubs and cults, actually. That's the one that always surprises people, which if you really get into cults, then it's not that surprising. But cults, it can happen on the street. It can happen in the store. Those are less common. The 2 most common places for recruitment are actually the foster care system, which is heartbreaking all on its own, and online. So in 2020, the U.S. government released a federal human trafficking report. That report found that 30% of all victims identified in federal sex trafficking cases since the year 2000 were recruited online. Over half of those people who were recruited online were recruited on Facebook. I think that's another common misconception. We're all tracking these crazy apps that WhatsApp, and I mean, it does happen there, or we're looking for Backpage, and, you know, there's escort services on Backpage. But Facebook is the number one place online where people are being recruited into human trafficking. And most of them are women and young girls. After Facebook, the other two apps were Snapchat and Instagram. And that same report revealed that children accounted for 53% of identified victims in active criminal human trafficking cases in 2020. 44% of victims of sex trafficking were women, and half of those were girls. Prior to the pandemic, the number two top recruiting places were strip clubs and the foster care system. After 2020, all the social media sites flew to the top. And since the strip clubs were shut down, it skyrocketed. And those numbers appear to be hanging up there. So it's almost like they figured out, hey, this is way easier than going into a strip club and actually talking someone into it. And we'll just hit them in their inbox on Facebook and do that right from the comfort of our home or hotel room or wherever the trafficker is living those days.
So you have a podcast. Can you tell us what the name of your podcast is and what's it about?
So Least of These is my podcast. It's a weekly true crime podcast that covers cases that you won't necessarily find in the headlines. I cover missing person cases, murder cases, both solved and unsolved, with the goal of educating the general public and advocating for justice for survivors.
To be a guest on the show, please email CriticalIncidentsPod@gmail.com. Until next time, stay safe.